Now, like me, if you are a millennial or younger, you're part of a cohort that has had the lowest rate of homeownership in recent history. But since I first heard about 3D printed houses a few years ago, I've been wondering, could that be the disruptive technology that comes to rescue us and give us that dream of an affordable house in future? Or would we be pinning our hopes on some fantasy tech that won't deliver? And even if the tech is viable, will it arrive in a time frame that could be helpful to our life plans? Could we actually buy a 3D printed house in the near future? I finally decided to dig into this, and I'm going to share what I found. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to form a point of view as to whether a 3D printed house is something you should factor into your thinking and future life plans. If you're new here, welcome to Futureflect. The world is changing really fast and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But here, we all calmly reflect on the future together, empowering us to not just survive, but thrive in that world of change. Now, before we get into the tech behind 3D printed housing, let's just first take a second to really understand the size of the housing problem. We often think about it on an individual scale. You want to buy a house, but the problem is really bad on a global scale too. According to the UN, the lack of affordable housing worldwide is a global crisis. An estimated 1.6 billion people, that's 1/5 of humanity, still lack access to adequate housing. And this number could rise to about 3 billion by 2030. Now, we often throw big numbers around, but 1.6 billion, think about that for a moment. How would you feel if that was your brother, your mother, or a really dear friend who just didn't have basic shelter? And this isn't a problem with what we'd just consider poorer countries. In the US, there's a shortfall of 5 million fewer homes than they need, and the hole gets 2 million homes deeper each year. In the UK, there's a backlog of 4.3 million homes, and it will take 50 years to fill, even if government targets are met. And in most countries, prices are growing way faster than incomes, making it even harder for those of us who do not have the money to buy. Now, to dig ourselves out of our hole, this business as usual just isn't going to work. It's going to require something that can perhaps reduce the cost by at least 50% and speed the process up from years into weeks. Well, this is where 3D printing could help. So let's take a quick look at the technology itself, which has been around for a while in various guises. The earliest reference to it is actually in 1939, when a guy called William E. Herschel painted it a wall building machine. That could be considered a precursor to modern 3D printers, as it had a layer by layer approach to laying down the concrete. And this idea of sort of laying down concrete is essentially how the majority of 3D printed housing tech works. Namely, you design a digital blueprint of the house on a computer, and then you get a really large robotic arm or a machine on a big track and a nozzle that then precisely extrudes concrete, building up the structure layer by layer. Essentially, a form of printing. Once the walls and the main structure are complete, other parts of the house like the roof, the windows, and the doors are added, either by traditional methods or printed separately and installed. Now, there's been various attempts and variations, but the big breakthroughs seem to happen from 2010 onwards, when printers started to emerge that had really good improvements in speed, accuracy, and materials. And some companies emerged like Contour Crafting and IPIS Core, and their tech allowed IPIS Core, actually their tech even allowed them to build a 38 square meter house in Russia in just 24 hours. And as the years have gone on, other companies have pushed the boundaries even further. So one of the startups I really liked was called Icon, which was based out of Texas. Now let's stick with Icon for a couple of minutes because they had one of the most helpful explanations on how 3D printing can dramatically lower the cost of construction. So let's look at their argument. Here you'll see essentially a value chain for a typical US house. Now, a value chain is just a fancy business school way to say, let's list out all the times and costs involved in building a house, whether that's buying the land, paying the architect, the fee for permits, and then the actual construction. So you'll see in total, it costs around $650,000 and typically takes 290 days. Now, what you'll note is the biggest part is construction. That's $400K, which is around 60% of the total cost. So the argument is, if we are able to use robotics, such as 3D printing, on that part of the value chain, it could have a transformative impact for society. And when you break down that $400K of construction costs, you'll see a large chunk is the foundation and the wall systems. So that's a great area to start with 3D printers. Now, what's really interesting is this graph here. This shows Icon's progress on cutting costs from 2018 to date for foundations and walls. Icon states that conventional building, which uses drywall, averages out at about $35 per square foot. But over the past few years, Icon has been able to drive down the cost of 3D printing to the point where they are cheaper than drywall. So 2024 actually represents a real inflection point. And those 290 days are now just a few weeks, even if you factor in site prep and finish work. So the cost and time savings can come from many places. For example, reduced labor. Once the machine is set up, it can then run automatically, so fewer workers are needed on site, which is helpful as in many countries there's a shortage of skilled construction workers anyway. Also, using concrete is cheaper than materials like bricks and wood. And also, there's typically less waste as 3D printing only uses material necessary for the structure. There's also other studies that are consistent with these cost reduction numbers. For example, this study from the UK also indicates that at the very least, one can expect 3D printed housing to be at least 30 to 50% cheaper than conventional housing. Okay, great. All of this sounds promising, but how will we be able to tell whether 3D printed houses will move from potential to something real that makes a practical difference in our lives? Well, one way is to keep an eye out for a range of signals over the next few years. And if we start seeing these signals get stronger and stronger over time, it means things are about to get really interesting. So what sort of signals are we talking about? Well, the first is cost. We've already seen a 10x reduction in the last 5 to 6 years, and we'll want to keep an eye on if that continues at a reasonable pace. Another signal will be any government projects and targets. We've already started to see this. The most ambitious government target out there was from Dubai, who aim to have 25% of all new buildings use 3D printing by 2030. There are other social housing plays emerging in other parts of the world. For example, in County Louth in Ireland, the local authorities engaged in a 3D printed social housing scheme. And Mvula Gardens in Kenya is Africa's largest affordable housing project. It's a neighborhood that consists of more than 50 3D printed houses. In addition to more government projects, another signal will be, well, to what extent do private developers also start to play with and accept this technology? And again, some early signals are emerging here. The most notable is that one of the US largest builders, Lennar, has started to work with Icon. Now, currently it seems around 6% of construction globally is using what's known as MMC, which means Modern Method of Construction, which is where 3D printing will fall under. So we'll want to see if that percentage starts to increase over time. There are many other ways to measure developer interest. So for example, if you in the future see a news article about a developer buying a 3D printing company, or they start to mention it more often on their quarterly earnings calls, that would be the sort of signal you'll really want to pay attention to. Another signal will be more formal regulation and quality frameworks relating to 3D printing and construction. Again, we're starting to see some early green shoots here. For example, there are organizations such as the ISO, which stands for International Organization for Standardization, and ASTM International. And these sorts of organizations create, like formal quality benchmarks. Now, in 2023, both of these organizations got together to establish a quality framework for 3D printed construction. Another signal will be whether insurance companies and financial institutions start to adapt their policies to accommodate 3D printed homes. For example, do we start seeing mortgages that are dedicated to 3D printed homes? And another macro signal will be climate adaptation. 3D printed houses tend to be much better suited to deal with natural disasters such as forest fires. So keep an eye out for what's happening in countries where those events that are becoming much more common, say in Southern Europe. In fact, we may even see insurance companies start to insist on rebuilds happening with 3D printed housing. There's also huge potential for this technology for making homes that are friendly for people who are aging. Think wide accessible spaces, rounded corners, and all sorts of beneficial structural aspects. Now, I've sold a great story, but it's not guaranteed that this will happen. And there are some signals that you should keep an eye out on that could serve as headwinds. For example, the availability and cost of land. If we look back at that value chain we looked at earlier, land was the second largest component of the cost. And depending what country you're in, that may still be a limitation. Also, bureaucracy could get in the way. Some governments just may not be nimble enough on planning rules and consent. Indeed, many home developers point out that they are already building faster than the planning process can handle. There may also be a debate about the sustainability of concrete, though 3D printed companies seem to recognize this and they have been investing quite heavily on improving the sustainability of that technology too. There's also some aesthetic factors. Will members of the public want to live in a house or a community that looks and feels really different to what we may have been used to in the past. And some may think that 3D printed housing harks back to the brutalist architecture of the 60s and 70s with massive monolithic exposed concrete buildings. That sort of architecture does have its fans. Think about the Barbican estate in London, which is considered desirable housing, but it is arguably an acquired taste. However, many startups are recognizing that a diversity of design and aesthetics will be important for this to work. And in fact, you can right now play with a couple of AI tools to design 3D printed housing. So there's this one here called Vitruvius AI, which Icon has put out there, and it gives us a glimpse of all the new possible designs that will be available in the future. So given all this, let's get back to the question we posed at the beginning. Will 3D printed housing be the big disruption that will finally allow you to afford that house soon? Well, now that you're armed with the key headlines, I'd encourage you to form your own point of view. But for what it's worth, I'll share my take having considered all the research. I think this feels real, and I think it's going to radically transform construction. And here's the thing, even if you're still a bit skeptical about 3D printing, then you don't even need to buy the thesis about 3D printing per se. All you have to believe is that technology is capable of disrupting construction in some profound way. For example, with the proliferation of AI robotics, I came across a recent example of a robot that can now do bricklaying. And you could imagine how this may offer a similar step change in cost and time of construction. And if that sort of tech disruption is coming to construction, then the next question will be, well, what about timelines? Will it help me buy that house soon? Well, I think as an elderly millennial, it's perhaps not yet mature enough for me to take advantage of this in the short run. And in the span of the next 5 years or so, whilst I do see it proliferating, I don't think it'll become mainstream to the point where it radically disrupts the supply or changes the economics for me. However, if you are younger, say in your early 20s, I think this is very much something you may be able to access. It should give you some hope that houses may be much more affordable by the time you get to your, say, early 30s or 35, as that's still 10 to 15 years away from you right now. By then, I think 3D printed houses will be a lot more mainstream. And as is often the way, it may take perhaps a tragic event to really catalyze things and bring this into the mainstream. For example, in 2023, we saw that huge earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And maybe after a big natural disaster like that in future, a forward-thinking government will believe the quickest and most economical way to rebuild a community will be to make use of 3D printing technology en masse. In the same way that we saw how the COVID crisis catalyzed the research and adoption of new vaccine platforms. Also, as migration patterns change and climate refugees become more common, governments may have to adopt this technology just to meet their housing targets, as that'll otherwise politically become a source of major civic discontent. So if you are younger, I'd encourage you to keep a really close eye on the signals that I mentioned earlier in the video. No matter whether you're in your 20s or your 40s though, I think there's even a bigger takeaway, which may inform your broader thinking about your finances and retirement plans. I think 3D printed housing could reset the purpose and value of a house to be about its original purpose of shelter, rather than as an investment. And this is important to mention because in many countries, including here in the UK, there's been this default assumption that house prices will always increase in the long run. And many use their house as a store of value and are disproportionately reliant on it for their retirement and pension plans. But it's clear that technology such as 3D printing may bring about a huge deflationary event, whether there's a massive decrease in construction costs and then perhaps an increase in housing supply. In short, your house may suddenly be worth a lot less in future. So no matter your current age, if you knew there's a chance that could happen in future, would that change anything about how you plan your finances and future retirement plans? That's something I'd encourage you to think about. And again, keep an eye out for the signals going forward. Now, for what it's worth, I think it would be amazing if housing was no longer this huge store of value, as it would free up zombie capital that's otherwise locked up passively in bricks and concrete. That capital can instead be deployed to fund the next amazing generation of ideas and businesses. Ideas that can help all of us increase our health and standard of living. And if housing were to become a commodity, that means those 1.6 billion people that we mentioned earlier may finally get access to a basic human right, which is an adequate roof over their head. And that would be perhaps one of the most profound things that technology could offer humanity. Now, that's what I think, but part of why I'm doing this is I really want to hear what other people think, including other Futureflectors like you. So, will 3D printed housing be the game changer we've been waiting for, or is it just another tech hype? I've shared my take, but now it's your turn. Please put in the comments and let me know what you think. Will this impact your future plan? Are there any signals I've missed that we should be watching? Thanks for your time, and please do subscribe to this channel if you found it helpful. And remember, always stay curious to stay ahead.